we've hired a new person starting soon, so I'll go back to being a PVC for research. Anyway, this seminar is an idea that came together as a result of the work of Chris Ember, Panikos Panay, Anna Maguire, and myself. And so we're now into our second semester. We had a very successful first semester. It's fantastic to see you all here. It's too late for saying Happy New Year, but Happy New Year anyway. What we do is we tend to share out the session for someone that we have invited in. So without further ado, I'll just remind you that I may ever put a message in the chat. We'll be recording this. It's very useful for people, researchers and students. If you don't want that, please let us know immediately, but we will be recording. And yeah, so without further ado, I'm going to go across to my colleague, Dr. Anna Maguire, and she will chair and host our speaker, who I'm very much looking forward to hearing. But I won't say another word. Thank you, Anna.
Thanks very much, Don, and welcome everyone to this first session of this new year. It's my very great pleasure to welcome Dr. Claudia Soares to give her paper this evening. She is formerly of my own parish at Queen Mary, but is now a British Academy postdoctoral fellow and NUACT fellow. I'm sure there's a fancier way of saying that, Claudia, than that, at Newcastle University. She's currently working on a funded project called In Care and Aftercare: Emotions, Welfare and Institutions in Britain, Australia and Canada from 1820 to 1930, which thinks about forms of new imperial history and histories of emotions. It examines the development of transnational policies and practices relating to the care and control of children and families at risk, and recovers the social and emotional experiences of marginalised individuals who spent time in a range of state and voluntary institutions. And certainly I will be asking Claudia a little bit more about that recovery in the questions. Her first book, A Home from Home, Children and Social Care in Victorian and Edwardian Britain, is forthcoming with Oxford University Press, so do keep an eye out for that. And she's published recently in the History of the Family, History Workshop Journal, the Journal of Victorian Culture, and the Journal of Historical Geography. In her paper this evening, she's going to be talking to us about child emigration in Britain and the British Empire through the 19th century and into the 20th. So without any further ado, Claudia, we'll hand over to you. Just a reminder, if people have questions, can I ask them to keep them to the end? And then I'll invite you to either pop them in the chat or to raise your hand and pose them to Claudia directly. But go ahead, Claudia. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Anna, and thanks, John. And thank you as well for the invitation to speak about my work today. So during the 19th and early 20th centuries, several major British charities facilitated the emigration of thousands of poor children residing in welfare institutions to different parts of the empire, including Canada and then later Australia. Emigration allowed these agencies a cost-effective means of disposing of children while also participating in complex forms of social engineering, allowing Britain to extend its power and control transnationally and to remake British society and values in new territories. Despite emigration being marketed as an avenue to increase prosperity and social mobility, existing research has overwhelmingly demonstrated the failings of these schemes. Child migrants have been painted as hapless and helpless victims who possessed little agency, ambition, or control in these life-changing events. In many cases, they were simply sources of cheap labour for exploitative employers. Oral histories and public inquiries about children's migration that have taken place from the mid-20th century have also revealed the scale of trauma and abuse that many suffered. Conclusions about 19th century child migration have demonstrated comparably poor outcomes and trajectories for these individuals. Very often these conclusions have been made based on limited but official documents such as inspection reports, contemporary government inquiries, evaluation of the substandard policies and practices regarding the provision of aftercare following children's relocation, and data about employment outcomes. Migrant voices, certainly from the 19th century, are often less systematically and comprehensively positioned at the centre of such research, in part due to the scattered nature of surviving material. So my paper today is part of a larger British Academy funded project about children's emotional experiences of institutional care and the transnational circulation of different and developing welfare policies and practices. As part of this project, I used the sources of several major British, Australian and Canadian welfare agencies to recover the social, emotional and sensory experiences on individual and collective levels. The objective of the paper today is to explore what migrants had to say about arriving and settling in their new countries. This includes some consideration of how they perceive their ties to home and family, their emotional experiences relating to how they recalled and remembered the old country, and how these feelings could be managed. The paper also interrogates how youths found comfort in their new locations, and specifically how they articulated their desires and ambitions and the meanings they assigned to their environments. All these feelings and experiences encountered on individual and collective levels were ever shifting across the life course, often in response to different contexts, events and knowledge. Nevertheless, they profoundly shaped young people's constructions and understandings of home and self, their feelings of belonging and identity. And to do so, the paper today will privilege emigrant letters, and it will draw on approaches from the history of emotions to examine children's understandings and their responses to their new surroundings. We know much about the experiences of migration and settling from the sources left behind by the middle and elite classes, but the experiences of poor migrants are often more difficult to ascertain. Very often there's little direct narration of their own accounts, and we catch only glimpses of their lives through various administrative documentation such as immigration forms, census material, land purchases and leases, and other similar sources. To gather the experiences of children, and poor migrant children in particular, the surviving material seems even more scant. However, turning to institutional records can provide a solution to this impasse. With emigration an increasingly contested practice across the 19th century, the processes by which children were sent overseas were increasingly bureaucratic. Despite assertions that institutions failed to obtain consent from relatives about children's emigration or the deliberate obscuring of their whereabouts, assertions which are all in many cases quite correct, documents relating to child's migration or children's migration proliferated. Today, my sources are emigrant letters that are located either in individual case records or published in institutional periodicals. One such publication, which I'll be drawing on quite heavily in this paper today, was Bernardo's periodical Ups and Downs, which was produced by the organisation's Toronto office, particularly for young migrants. These published letters have a much longer history. They fit into a larger corpus of letters from residential inmates and other child migrants in other organisations and agencies. Institutional staff recognised that these letters had value and interest in themselves too. Letters were increasingly published in official documents such as annual reports as evidence of institutional success, while others like Maria Rai published collections of letters received from child migrants. And one such example of this is Maria Rai's book, What the People Say About the Children and What the Children Say About Canada, which was published in 1871. Some scholars have cautioned against the use of published correspondence found in institutional periodicals, and these sources have too often been dismissed as overly problematic. It's often difficult to ascertain the veracity of these letters, the degree to which they might be censored, edited, mediated, or even fictionalised, and they can be challenging to uncover the reasons for writing in the first place. In some cases, the author's name has been anonymised, making efforts to locate original copies of these letters in archival material, if indeed they survive, impossible. These letters are deliberate and self-conscious sources. There were likely several stages at which these letters might be shaped by adults. The reasons and motives for writing and the anticipated reception of institutions to these letters, as well as issues such as their selection for publication and the editing process by which that occurred, are all possibilities that historians must consider and contend with. We're rarely afforded insight into the processes of selecting letters for publication within these periodicals. However, this paper demands that we do pay greater attention to these sources while taking these issues into account in their interpretation. And to provide balance and counterpoint to these published letters are supplemented by readings of private personal correspondence from migrants, also written to institutional staff. And so in order to use such letters effectively, we must be sensitive to two pressing issues that I just want to highlight briefly here. The first is the nature of the survival and preservation of these letters, the conditions of which are highly varied across the institutional archives that I've consulted for this work. The survival of this correspondence is patchy at best, and often the ways that these letters are then preserved and catalogued within archives can be both problematic at times and at times advantageous, requiring different sets of skills in order to interrogate and interpret them fully. The second issue relates to the motives for writing, and in many cases this could stem from requests that children had for further support once they had migrated. In many cases, staying in touch became part of a strategic and deliberate attempt to establish a network of support by migrants who, in their new locations, had few advocates. And often their attempts to keep in contact were just simply efforts to maintain friendships with those that they had felt familiar with. In addition, institutional staff and young migrants played a role in perpetuating and promoting cultures of success and gratitude. So migrants were knowledgeable about the models of success perpetuated by institutional staff, while other young people were keen to appear grateful for the opportunity of improved life chances. These cultures meant that letters could be deceptive or hyperbolic in their claims and content, but I'm happy to talk in greater detail about the source material in the questions. Discussions about children's migration, particularly in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, has focused overwhelmingly on issues of consent. It's generally agreed that Bernardo deliberately obscured information about children's impending emigration or failed to obtain the necessary consent from children's relatives, but this doesn't reflect the practices of all migration agencies. The Waifs and Strays Society, which was the second largest children's institution in the later decades of the 19th century, was much more rigorous about obtaining consent to emigration, which was usually done both at the time of application to the institution, as well as closer to the time of emigration. So relatives were asked to re-articulate their consent closer to the time of departure. Historian Lynn Abrams has confirmed that quarries homes in Scotland also sought to obtain consent from closest living relatives in as many cases as possible. Emigration was widely debated and very much present in public consciousness in the later decades of the 19th century. Only recently had there been fierce debates about transportation, which led to the ultimate demise of the practice, as well as the establishment of many new assisted and unassisted schemes that facilitated the relocation of many labouring and middle-class families. Reading case file material demonstrates how emigration schemes were imagined among the poorest members of society. The prospect of emigration elicited varied and complex emotions. Many parents expressed their preference not to stand in the way of their children's wishes, and others understood migration to offer a new world of opportunity for children to better themselves. In some cases, emigration of the whole family had obviously been considered by parents prior to children's admission to these institutions. There are some records that I've come across that indicated that agencies like Bernardo's and the Waifs and Strays Society were used deliberately and expressly for children's emigration, while their parents made use of other assisted and unassisted schemes that that facilitated their own relocation, so that eventually they might reunite in their new country several months later. But understandably, poor families also recognised the lasting separation that emigration would cause, and wrote repeatedly and adamantly to express their objection. Of the 352 children selected as suitable for emigration by the Waifs and Strays Society between 1881 and 1914, 43% of parents objected to the practice. Other families likely saw the emigration in similar terms as transportation, presumably a punishment that was meted out by welfare agencies for the perceived crimes of poverty or misbehaviour. Esther R., one mother, for example, wrote about her two children, Emily and Ellen, who were placed in the Waifs and Strays Society, stating that she hoped that they would be obedient and good children so that they might be able to stay in England. The published accounts of preparing to depart for England demonstrate that children felt as if they were active participants in decisions about their own destinies. These accounts also confirm that Bernardo adopted a particularly laissez-faire approach to selecting children for emigration, practices which appear to be at one extreme of the spectrum when compared to other institutional practices. Richard Wright wrote that after being at Bernardo's Stepney home for nearly 2 months, one morning a staff member asked if there were any boys who wished to go to Canada and would they please stand up. Richard put himself forward. Other accounts suggested that staff members spoke to children regularly about the subject of Canada and then asked them if they would like to go. The language used by other young people suggests that they felt that they were active participants in these decisions. Herbert Ward's letter, for example, stated, "I had been in the homes 3 months and had made up my mind to be an emigrant to Canada. Whether or not Herbert's father, who had apparently agreed to his son's admission to Bernardo's homes, was consulted about his emigration remains unknown." Meanwhile, Henry H., who was placed in the Waifs and Strays Society, waged a prolonged battle with his mother Maria about his emigration. He wrote several times to cajole her into consenting, and wrote a final time stating, "I want you to understand that it would be best for me to emigrate. If you don't answer, they will send me home whether you like it or not. Remember, let me know before the week is out whether you will agree. I want you to grant my wish, which is emigration to Canada, so I can make good use of myself. It's the Society's wish that I emigrate to Canada, as I won't always have a mother and I want to strike out for myself and get on in the world." His attempts to force her consent ultimately failed, and he was instead transferred to one of the Society's homes closer to London, where Maria perhaps felt that she could keep a closer eye on him. Once children had been approved for emigration, case records reveal that parties assembled and children sailed to Canada relatively quickly, often within 12 weeks. It's unlikely that many were able to say proper goodbyes to their relatives, although there is evidence that some children, both in Bernardo's and the Waifs and Strays, were granted permission to spend a day with visiting relatives prior to their departure. William Percy Thomas, who entered the Waifs and Strays care in June 1905, emigrated when he was 14 years old in 1910. He wished to emigrate and his mother consented. His records show that his mother was able to visit him prior to his departure, and she kept in touch with him and with both him and institutional staff following his arrival in Canada. Meanwhile, Cyril Warburton, who entered the Waifs and Strays Society after his father died, emigrated in 1911 when he was 15. Several months prior to his departure, he was transferred to a residential home that was closer to his mother's home in Altrincham, so that she would be able to visit him regularly before he sailed. Other relatives were notified of the date of departure and were able to make their way to the port to bid their farewells to children. Little value has been placed on migrants' accounts of these journeys, despite occupying a significant place within their life cycle. A few traces of their feelings and experiences of their journeys are found in the odd letter back to the institution, or in later memoirs and autobiographies, or in oral histories conducted with migrants and their descendants. When migrants did speak of their journeys, their accounts are often in stark contrast to each other. Some spoke of a grueling journey marked by severe seasickness, while others spoke of the excitement they felt on their departure and the comradeship that they felt on board with their peers. Children's knowledge about the imperial environment prior to arriving was shaped by representations of colonial life in the periodical press, which perpetuated environmental racism and ecological imperialism. Children's colonial literature emphasised the dangers of the natural world, unfamiliar, hostile wildernesses with dangerous climates and predatory wildlife. Such representations promoted a sense of the exotic and of adventure. These environments were characterised as offering little of the civilised and cultivated beauty of the English landscape, and instead literature promoted the idea that settlers had battled, tamed and overcome nature and indigenous people. In addition, numerous accounts and guides to Canada, which had been in circulation from the early decades of the 19th century, and some of which intended to directly address and instruct potential migrants, also provided knowledge about what awaited these young migrants on their arrival. Some of the letters written by children drew on such ideas of exoticism and nature's unruliness. Herbert Panting wrote, "I never thought when I first came here that I would stop in my place so long. It seemed to me such a wild country and such hard work, and I used to be dead tired." But in many cases, migrants expressed their surprise and delight in finding a beautiful country that for some did resemble England. Perhaps unsurprisingly, migrants' letters demonstrate that many initial, often sensory reactions which focused on the geography, environment and climate of their new surroundings. Like other colonial settlers, children corresponded in depth about their new environments. The climate, landscape, soil, vegetation and wildlife frequently took centre stage in their letters. This is unsurprising. Many children were transported from industrial urbanscapes to wholly foreign rural settings. Moreover, these young people had been sent out on a nostalgic mission to build the empire by working the land. Institutions had prepared migrants to contribute to the construction of and participation in idyllic rural communities across the empire. This preparation had included practical skills to develop their employment, such as agricultural and horticultural training. The observations that migrants made about their locations demonstrate that feelings of home could be intimately bound up with how they saw and experienced their environments, which in turn profoundly shaped their emotional experiences. George Tucker emigrated to Barnardo's Toronto home in April 1888 at the age of 16. In January 1899, he wrote to the editor of Ups and Downs, succinctly describing the feelings of bewilderment that awaited him after stepping off the ship. He stated, "The country was like a desert to me, nothing to be seen but deep snow, and a very stormy day it was to me. I was a perfect stranger in a strange country." In the first of several letters written by Thomas Fragel in January 1899, the 12-year-old wrote about his expectations of his new home in Canada, recalling that, "Before I left England, I was under the impression that I was coming to a wild, desolate country inhabited by a few white people and Indians. Upon my arrival at Quebec, these thoughts left me, as I found a bracing climate and beautiful scenery, but, more than all, a nice, sociable people." Such letters emphasise the unfamiliarity and strangeness that children felt on arrival in the wildness and sometimes wilderness of the Canadian environment. But writing about their new environments made them familiar and understandable, not only for letters recipients left behind at home, but also for their authors, who continually sought to make sense of their experiences and feelings about their arrival. Much of the research on recent and contemporary mobility has emphasised the importance of space and place and its effects on migrants' ideas about home. Place affiliation, feelings of homesickness, dislocation and estrangement, as well as homemaking practices all have the potential to shape migrants' search and feel for home. But much less historical research is focused on perceptions of home for migrants. Understanding ideas about home among child migrants is particularly important For many children, home is a principal space that acts as a crucial reference point in their world and profoundly affects perceptions about their place within it. How then did these migrants find comfort, and how did institutions support the process of remaking home? How did they conceive of their ambitions and desires about home? And how did they grapple with the task of fashioning a new identity in Canada? With no family to support these young migrants, and with their peers often located at great distances, institutions focused on helping migrants to reflect on and build a relationship with the environment around them. Again, this is unsurprising given that young people were trained and prepared for types of employment and lifestyles that necessitated a much closer relationship with nature than they had previously had in England. Features in Bernardo's periodical for migrants, for example, held competitions that solicited the best essays from migrants on themes such as why I like to live in Canada, the season in the year that I like best and why, and a description of the country within 5 miles of where you live. Such exercises intended to help youths manage and regulate less positive emotions about their circumstances, and to encourage them to find appreciation for and forge positive emotions about their new locations. Alfred Jolly wrote that he liked Canada because it's a healthful country, the sharp, frosty winters clearing the air of impurities. It's a fine, healthy climate. Alfred Sidney Shaw echoed such sentiments, stating, I like Canada for her green summers and her golden harvests, her bright, bracing winters and her sunny spring. Henry wrote at length about his enthusiasm and love for his adopted country, stating, I like to work in the fields, for it's much more pleasanter than it is working in the dull city of London. It is more pleasant to see the rich fields of grain than it is to see the busy street and the crowds of working men rushing to their work. I like to work in the harvest fields and to hear the sweet song of the birds as they fly to and fro, and to listen to the hum of the binder as it is cutting down the grain and making it into sheaves. Other migrants were perhaps more honest about their initial feelings. William Mabie wrote, I did not care much about it at first, but I like it now. Another boy wrote, I must confess I did not fall in love with the country at first, nor yet within a month after, but now I would not leave Canada for any purpose whatever, unless it was for my benefit. Migrating to Canada in 1894, George Hearn wrote 3 years later, stating, when I first came to Canada, everything looked so strange, and I did not know very well what to think of it the first week or two. I was pretty lonely and homesick, and I wished I was back in England, and now I think that Canada is a very nice place to live in. George's letter painted a picture of his bewilderment and disorientation in this new and unfamiliar environment. He did not know how to make sense of where he had arrived. These feelings increased his desire not only to return to his old country from which he was dislocated, a place that offered him a greater sense of security, comfort, and contentedness, despite the hardships he had likely encountered over his 14 years, and which had ultimately led to his institutionalization. George's letter is remarkable in its very direct narration of his feelings about Canada, but typical of many other migrants' early letters describing their new circumstances. These letters indicated the yearning felt for the old country, their feelings of discontent, dislocation, and the uncanniness of being in a strange new world. But importantly too, the letter and other similar letters proceeded to indicate that feelings could change over the years that they lived there. George's letter described in detail his work outdoors on a farm, tending to cattle, chopping down wood for winter, and bringing in the harvest. The letter suggests that it was these new routines, skills, and knowledge that was gained from this work that helped him to adopt new patterns and modes of daily life, and ultimately changed his feelings about where he might call home. In coming to terms with and understanding their new locations, letters frequently drew to the parallels and novel, exciting differences between the old country and the new. And in doing so, letters particularly emphasised the advantages of a rural environment. At the forefront of welfare policies about child rescue were what Keith Williams has labelled the twin myths of urban degeneration and rural revitalisation. Welfare reformers promoted anti-urban sentiments in which environment was blamed for many of the physical and moral ills that blighted Britain's poorest families. Fears arose about the association between pollution and crime. Putrid smoke and fog not only weakened the health and morals of the poor, but poor visibility lent itself well to obscuring criminality and other vices and disorders. The belief that the poor child could be saved by their relocation from urban to rural settings also underpinned and justified emigration programmes. The benefits and virtues of the rural were extolled with much ferocity across institutional periodicals and likely within the homes themselves. Ups and downs reflected some of the prevailing attitudes about urban and rural environments. One article stated that although we in Canada are perhaps apt to imagine we feel the dreariness of November more keenly than we did in the old land, we are at least spared that English November scourge, fog. Such ideas were in turn perpetuated by young migrants who confirmed their belief in the superiority of the Canadian environment in their letters. Samuel Ling complained that England is too thickly populated and has more competition than Canada. Although the climate is damp and a little close sometimes, it's beautiful compared to that of England. Eleanor Mills similarly stated that here the air is clear, while at England there are fogs and mists nearly all the time, especially at London, where there is smoke as well as fog, which makes it very disagreeable to live there. Meanwhile, Alice Parsons wrote a lengthy account of her life in Canada, concluding, "Canada in everything is much better than England," emphasising that there was much more space, less crowds, the spring was more joyous after the long winter's rest, and there was less traffic with no danger of getting run over. For many others, however, value was placed less on the natural environment and instead on their material improvements in life. The ability to, as Herbert Ward stated, eat a good meal 3 times a day was enough for him to enjoy his new home in Canada. Others acknowledged that their greatest blessings were having warm clothing, comfort and shelter, which had been hard to find in England. William Wilmot asked, "What does one care when he gets lots of good food and some good warm clothes, how hard it freezes?" What many letters suggested too were migrants' dreams and ambitions of financial independence and the ability to make a home and family of their own. The ability to live more comfortably than their parents, whose hardship in many cases had resulted in the breakdown of the family unit, would have no doubt been a dream of some. John Bodger wrote, "I have made up my mind to go and get myself a farm. I was thinking of going to Algoma because I want to grow fruit trees. Mixed farming I intend to go in for. I shall have to take government land if I can get it because my capital is small. I am very anxious to start on life's journey. I have only put my foot at the bottom of the steep hill and I have it to climb." For Lydia Rowe, who migrated in 1886, a devoted husband, 2 children and her own farm was enough for her to feel very happy and contented, though she stated that she often reminisced fondly about her old institutional home in Britain. Meanwhile, William Eaton's letter, sent in 1903, coolly stated, "When I leave here, if I ever do, I'm going to be a farmer. As soon as I can get a place, I'm going to put some fine buildings on it so that my master and mistress can come and visit. I don't think I could get into the hands of better people in the Northwest. Don't think that I am telling any lies, because I'm not. I guess I will make my home in Canada. I won't go back to England again. You can get lots to eat out here. I did not think it was so good out here, but I've found it out now. I would rather be out in the field ploughing than in the streets selling newspapers. You get lots of fresh air in the fields. You ain't breathing smoke all the time. You bet the farm is the place for me, not the streets. I think I will quit now. My fingers are getting tired. I am one of your boys, William Eaton." As other historians have argued, despite emigration being marketed as a route to success, opportunity, independence and prosperity, many migrants found it exceedingly difficult to keep the wolf from the door. Poverty plagued many migrants after their arrival, and some, like Rebecca Titterton, found it impossible to carve out either independence or respectability in their new locations. Rebecca found herself destitute and homeless following the death of both her parents in County Down in the 1840s. She entered the local workhouse, where she was identified as supposedly religious and morally pure, traits that made her an attractive candidate for emigration to the New South Wales colony under the Earl Grey Orphan Scheme, which sought to relieve the burden on the overcrowded Irish workhouses and to redress a gender imbalance in the settler colony. Rebecca left Ireland 2 years into the Great Famine in June 1848, aged 17, sailing with 185 other orphans. She arrived in the colony alone in October that year with a box of meagre personal possessions and an outfit provided by the Poor Law Commissioners. She was employed as a house servant for 2 years, earning £9 a year before marrying Peter Downs, who had been convicted of sheep stealing and transported to the colony from County Wexford over a decade earlier. The Earl Grey scheme intended to offer a better life to Rebecca, but the colonial press reveals a persistently troubled life. Over the course of a decade, Rebecca gave birth to 7 children, most of whom did not survive into adulthood. While her husband was reported to be a respectable, steady and sober man, Rebecca was described as a drunkard, and she appeared several times in court charged with drunkenness, use of obscene language, and for assaulting her neighbour's infant child. Her fondness for liquor made her an incapable mother. She was in the habit of sending her young daughter, Bridget, out to procure gin for her, and Bridget was subsequently picked up repeatedly by local police. By the early 1860s, Rebecca had separated from her husband Peter, and by 1867 she may well have abandoned her family altogether or had died in relative obscurity and poverty. Both Rebecca and her husband failed to make a success of their lives in the colony or offer a better future for their children. In 1867, their 16-year-old daughter Bridget was identified by a local police constable to be regularly keeping the company of prostitutes, and began her own cycle of institutionalisation and imprisonment, with her admission initially to Newcastle Industrial School for 2 years, and that's Newcastle in New South Wales, not the UK. Sadly, Bridget continued Rebecca's legacy of crime and drunkenness. Following her release, she turned to prostitution to make ends meet for herself and her 2 young illegitimate children. It's likely that Bridget died by the age of 25, leaving her 2 young children behind. I've not yet been able to trace the whereabouts of her children, but the trajectory was unlikely to have been particularly promising. Inevitably, there were many young people who remained ill at ease and discontent with what they had encountered in the colonies. Their hopes and dreams for a better life did not match what greeted them on arrival. Many others tried their best to settle, but found it impossible to feel at home in the colony. As historian Susan Matt has shown, the condition of homesickness was widely acknowledged to be a serious condition prior to the 20th century that was often brought about by the trauma associated with migration, which was rarely an easy or natural process. Various constituents of home have been yearned for by migrants throughout history, including the domestic coziness of family homes, bonds with family and friends, and for the cities, towns and villages that they were familiar with. But child migrants often had more complicated histories and experiences of home and family life. And the children that I study here that have spent some time in residential institutions had little semblance of what we would imagine to be comfortable home life, while others had very knotty and problematic relationships with family members. Despite these difficulties, child migrants were no different to other colonial settlers across the empire. Both visitors' reports of young migrants, as well as the letters they sent back to institutional staff, indicate that most young people navigated feelings of homesickness and loneliness at some point while they settled in their new locations. Lily Andrews was 16 when she arrived in Canada in 1895 and was soon after placed out in employment in Niagara-on-the-Lake with her mistress, Mrs. Thonger. She received routine visits from Barnardo's inspector, Alfred Owens, But in 1897, the report suggested that Lily still had not adapted to her new life and home. Owen's report that Lily's employer liked her and generally reported her to be contented and happy. However, Mrs. Thonger noted that she was feeling a little lonely in her placement, but thought that she shall get on nicely when she is more accustomed to the place and the work. Lily had already been in her place for 2 years, a significant period of time to have settled into the routines of her new life. Often young people's inability to settle was explained by a deficit in their character. A report about one girl, anonymised to just her initials FH, aged 15, was that the girl does not seem happy. Mr. Owens described her as having a quiet, retiring disposition and possibly slow, which partly accounts for her complaints. This account indicated that rather than the experience of migration itself or the nature of employment, it was instead the girl's nature and character that had prevented her from being successful. Owens reported that although the mistress was anxious not to lose the girl, it was advisable for her to have a change. Bernardo's periodical Ups and Downs was replete with other mentions of young people's homesickness and sense of dislocation. The October 1897 issue, for example, stated that Susan Pigott, one of our latest arrivals, had scarcely got over the strangeness of a new beginning, but there seemed very reasonable hope that she would prove satisfactory in the future. Alongside the yearning for family and friends, one issue of Ups and Downs suggested that migrants' recollections and imaginings of the British landscape intensified feelings of longing and discontent. The article stated, "They see England in her May-Day beauty, which no doubt is difficult to match in any part of the earth. They see their friends bidding them welcome, perhaps the mother, sister, and baby brother, with fond caresses. And suddenly awaking from this pleasant dream, they find themselves between the handles of a cranky plough which has struck a root while looking back and thrown them clean out of the furrow, and all this on a lonely northwest farm. They are downright homesick and vow that the next cattle ship from the port of Montreal will carry them straight to England, home and beauty." Here the periodical indicated that the Canadian remoteness, alongside the realities of labour required in employment, accounted for young people's homesickness, especially when set against a romanticised view of England. But such reveries of sublime England were abruptly dismantled as the periodical reminded young migrants that their place in the world was in Britain's industrial towns, not its rural landscapes. If they returned, these young people would find themselves in the hot, dusty city where the fight for bread is bitter and incessant, where employment, difficult at all times to obtain, even when once secured, gives barely sufficient to pay the rental for the little box called by compliment a room, and to purchase the food from day to day necessary to keep soul and body together. The periodical repeatedly reminded migrants that it was distance that lent enchantment to the view. Homesickness was routinely mentioned in migrants' letters. Edgar Alden, who migrated to Canada in 1913 when he was aged 15, was placed out as a farmhand and wrote back several times to indicate the loneliness he felt in employment. He endeavoured to stay in touch regularly with his mother and sister, who remained in England. Despite his unhappiness in Canada, he worked hard and managed to save some money. In June 1917, he wrote to the institution to let them know that he wished his money and savings to be passed on to his sister in the event of his death during the war. Only 3 months later, he was killed in action in France. George Alfred Gilderson was aged 18 when he left England with a party of Bernardo's boys, arriving at Toronto in the spring of 1890. When Ups and Downs was first published in 1895, George became a regular correspondent to the magazine, writing several times a year on various subjects, including reflections on how he spent his first Christmas in Canada, his progress and his work, and of course sending donations fairly regularly towards the institution's work. Evidently, he retained a fondness for the institution and its staff, reflected in these attempts to continue his communications with the agency. He also articulated his attachment in letters. He wrote in 1895, "I am getting along nicely here and think very highly of Canada, but at times I get a little homesick. I often think of the happy days spent in the dear old home and the kindness of Dr. Bernardo." Homesickness was an affliction that was so common among young migrants that Bernardo's devoted several articles in their periodical to discussions that aimed to help manage and regulate these feelings. These articles helped to mediate and shape migrants' feelings and experiences through the validation of some emotions and by encouraging the suppression of less desirable feelings such as homesickness, grief, and loneliness. The magazine normalised such responses. Loneliness and homesickness were part and parcel of the changes associated with arriving in a new and unfamiliar environment and making the decision to get used to the new rhythms of life. Although such articles liked little to make other youths feel less isolated, the magazine attempted to reassure readers that these feelings were fleeting and could be quickly overcome through acceptance, grit, and gumption. To do so, young people must make the best of what they had and try to be happy. Happiness, the magazine repeatedly promoted, was a feeling that each individual must take personal responsibility for, a choice that each young person must make in spite of the issues that they might face. The article stated, "Cultivate a contented and happy disposition, and you will find much to please and to be thankful for wherever you are, either in town or country, and without this you will find it difficult to be satisfied in either." Discussing the homesickness that George Gilderson felt, the periodical expressed the institution's hope that may the time never come when George or any other boy ceases to have at times a little touch of it. It is not an unhealthy sign. On the contrary, the boy or man whose heart does not throb occasionally with a strange yearning for old friends and old associations, homesickness, when not allowed the mastery, does not indicate a discontented mind. Meanwhile, another article argued that homesickness was natural and stated, "We are well acquainted with the warm feeling which our boys entertain for the old motherland. Love of the birthland dies hard. Particularly so is this, we believe, with Englishmen." Institutional staff were tasked with offering solutions and reassurance to those suffering from homesickness. While controversial practices adopted by welfare agencies ensured that some migrants never saw or heard from relatives again, evidence shows that many young people managed to maintain connections from afar. Moreover, ups and downs argued that maintaining connections with friends and family left behind at home was one such antidote. In 1900, it reminded young migrants of their obligations to keep in touch with parents and advised readers thus: "Boys, whatever else you neglect, whomsoever else you forget, surely think of your mother. Mother, the sweetest, the homeliest word in the language, it is written on every boy's heart. Woe betide you if it's blotted out." The periodical suggested that boys were more likely to neglect their duties in keeping in touch with their families. Mr. Owen, Bernardo's inspector for young migrants, lamented the large number of letters he received written by distressed mothers who asked piteously for news of a son who never wrote. Acknowledging the strength of family bonds, Bernardo's introduced a programme that helped migrants return to England for a holiday to visit loved ones. In addition, it set up a scheme that helped young people facilitate the migration of their family members to join them. Rosina and Sarah Wagner, both pictured here, they migrated in 1897 to join their brother John, pictured in the centre, who had migrated a few years earlier. They saved enough money between them to bring their mother out to Canada in 1904, having not seen her by that point for several years. Rosina wrote to Bernardo's later that year to report that her mother had found employment in a town close to her and liked Canada so well that she did not wish to return to England. Rosina and her sister Sarah remained in Canada, marrying and having large families of their own. Meanwhile, Rosina's mother remarried shortly after her arrival in Canada, and Rosina's brother John crossed the border into the US, where he also married and raised a family of his own. None of the family returned to England to live permanently. Similarly, Fred Beasley migrated to Canada in 1891, and in 1896, at the age of 23, he articulated his desire that his mother and sisters might come out to Canada to join him. He saved enough money to send for one of his sisters, and she came out with the April 1896 Barnardo's Party and settled near to Fred in Port Rowan. He stated, "I think that now my sister is here, we shall be able to work together to bring my mother and the rest of my sisters out here." Many children who were migrated by voluntary agencies like the Wagners or Fred Beasley joined relatives already residing in Canada or were eventually joined by other family members. Reginald Austin migrated in 1920 through the National Children's Home emigration programme at the age of 15 and found employment. He received inspections for 5 years following his migration. Reginald's mother and father had relocated to Canada shortly after his emigration, and following his father's death, his mother had remarried. In August 1925, Reginald's employer stated that he was a very good worker and he desired to keep him for a 4th year, but were obliged to let him go on account of the threats made by his mother and stepfather, who wished Reginald to go home with them. He joined his parents and they later settled together as a family in British Columbia. There were limited opportunities for young people to voice their discontent about their experiences. Inspection reports provide only a partial glimpse of some of the feelings of the unhappiness about their circumstances. These inspections primarily measured employment performance, and they focused disproportionately on the employer's highly subjective accounts of progress in work, many of whom were quick to highlight the weaknesses of young workers. WSS, which is the Waifs and Strays Society, their inspector, Mr. Manning, paid a surprise visit to Ethel A, who was aged 15, and reported that Ethel was doing very well a year after arriving in Canada. Ethel's own report stated that, "I like this place very much and I'm getting on very well. We have such a lovely baby boy and I help to take care of him." 18 months later, Mr. Manning paid Ethel another surprise visit, this time when her employer was away. Ethel's report was quite different, perhaps as a result of her employer's absence. Mr. Manning observed that Ethel appeared fairly bright and very capable, but evidently not contented. Ethel's dissatisfaction stemmed from her perceived lack of freedom and control. She stated, "I would like to have my wages to spend and choose my own clothes. Everybody tells me that I have quite good taste and that I should have higher pay." Noting her wish, Mr. Manning called again to negotiate her release from her employer so that he could transfer her elsewhere. The employer agreed, but seemingly put out by her dissatisfaction, provided an uncomplimentary parting remark, stating that Ethel can be a very useful girl if she chooses, but she does not always choose to. Having emigrated a few years before, Laura Waugh wrote to Maria Rye in January 1871 about her good progress in employment in Canada. But within her letter, she reported the unhappiness of a fellow migrant and friend, Emily. She stated that Emily is a very bad girl. She tells lies to her mistress and masters. She dips her fingers into jam and pies and things that do not belong to her. She makes faces behind their back and then tells another lie afterwards and said she doesn't like being in Canada and that she would rather be with her aunt in Halifax, where she can get plum pudding every Sunday. Some youths, of course, struggle to find their feet in Canada, especially if, like Emily or Ethel, they felt discontent with their new lives. It's likely that despite the promise of greater opportunity and better fortune, many simply struggled with the same issues they had encountered in England: poverty and misfortune, stigma, mistreatment, and exploitation. Distance from a network of support, chiefly relatives and friends, undoubtedly made such struggles even harder. Letters from those that remained in Canada acknowledged that they faced distinct prejudice in relation to their identity, particularly as poor orphans from residential homes. Labelled the British home children, articles in the local press at times stoked feelings of fear and apprehension about the character and morals of new migrants and questioned the emigration programmes more broadly. There were, of course, some stories of migrants who committed serious offences, and these often garnered much attention in the press. Hilda Blake, who found herself an orphan at the age of 9 and an inmate of her local workhouse near Norwich, emigrated to Canada in 1888 with her brother. She started working for a few years as a servant in a farm home in Manitoba. In 1899, she purchased a gun and a few weeks later shot her mistress in a fit of rage and jealousy. She initially blamed the shooting on a tramp who, passing by the farm, had begged for some food and had been denied. She later confessed to the crime and requested the most severe punishment. She was later hung that year. Such stories did not help the plight of many migrants who often found themselves unfairly blamed for instances of petty crime in local communities. Ups and Downs acknowledged the ill feeling that circulated towards migrants in many of the smaller communities, stating, "We sometimes hear of articles vilifying and abusing the character of our boys in terms so often utterly indecent and scurrilous." One young migrant lamented, "I cannot speak for Dr. Bernardo's children more than any others, but if they came from an orphan's home at all, that is sufficient to brand them as vicious, unreliable vagrants before they have a chance to prove that they are anything different." In response to the challenges faced, it's likely that some migrants must have tried to hide their identities as home children in order to be accepted and respected, or to find employment or command higher wages. Other migrants sought to defy these attitudes or to prove them to be incorrect and encourage others to do the same. Harry Cooper reassured his peers that it's not worth giving much thought to the subject, for those who are prejudiced against us are narrow-minded people whose knowledge of human nature does not reach a very high limit. The same prejudice used to exist in this part of the country, but the boys and girls from Dr. Bernardo's homes, as well as from the Marchmont home at Belleville, have lived so as to be a credit to themselves, a credit to Dr. Bernardo and to his system of training, so that the prejudice is all gone now, and the home boys and girls hold their heads just as high and perhaps a little higher than the Canadian youths. Why shouldn't we? Other young people felt pride in being able to say that they were home children, as Jane Jeffrey did. In 1897, she sent a portrait of herself and her husband back to institutional staff and stated, "If any of the ladies come round here visiting, I want them to call and see me. I am a home girl still, even if I am married, and I am not ashamed to tell everybody that calls on me." James Ivey confirmed that he was proud to call himself a Bernardo's boy. Meanwhile, Emily Manning, emigrated in July 1884, wrote, "How strange the Canadian ways were to us. We thought we should never get used to them, and I have no doubt we got discouraged and wished we were back in England. But even those feelings passed away, and here we are, staid old Canadians, though we shall never lose our love for our native country. I am afraid we should not recognise the village were we to go back. I can never forget the place where so many happy days of my childhood was spent." Like Emily, many others built an affinity with their new country and firmly felt that they belonged there in their new home. This was all the more apparent when the subject of returning to England was considered. Herbert Panting firmly stated, "I would not go back to the old country to live for anything now, though of course I shall always have fond recollections of the dear old land, and perhaps sometime in the future I shall go there for a visit, but nothing else." William Leonard, who migrated in 1907 with the Waifs and Strays Society, also hoped to return permanently. In 1910, he got back in touch with his sister Julia, who he had not seen for 12 years. His correspondence articulated that he was doing very well in Canada, liked his master and mistresses, but yearns just a little for the old country. Getting back in touch prompted him to save for his return the following year. As he had hoped, he returned in 1911 to live with his sister for a while, but he struggled to find work. His sentimental notion of the old country was beginning to unravel as he struggled to establish himself. He was forced to apply for welfare assistance once again and reapproach the waifs and strays for help. He was referred on to another agency but disengaged with the organisation before they could offer assistance. His experience of returning to England did not live up to what he imagined it to be. Despite his yearning for England, the reality of once again being dependent on both his sister and charity may have exacerbated feelings of discord and perhaps disappointment about his sense of self and place in the world. Renewing family bonds was difficult work for those who had lived away from family for many years, and perhaps his attempts to reconnect with his sister did not provide him with the sense of belonging he had hoped for. Although records are scant, at some point William made up his mind to return to Canada. Records show that he died suddenly from heart failure in 1933, and although several family members survived, local news reports indicate that several of the Society's old boys and his former employer, to whom William had been particularly attached, attended to celebrate his life. The Society's letter to notify his sister of his death was returned to sender. So I just want to finish up with my conclusion. So this paper has briefly highlighted what child migrants made of Canada, this so-called new world of abundance. It doesn't seek to overturn the dominant narrative that children's migration was controversial, inhumane, and that young people experienced extreme hardship and trauma following their migration. Its focus isn't on evaluating these programs, but instead on centering the child and their voice within research to listen to and understand more carefully what children experienced, sensed and felt, which was varied, uneven and often changing. In doing so, it demonstrates the shifting meanings they gave to their surroundings, experiences and their ideas of home, both old and new. Some of the letters here too have demonstrated the emotive power of landscape and environment. Migrants responded to the aesthetics of environment in different ways, but overwhelmingly the descriptions provided in their letters suggest their curiosity and appreciation with their local surroundings and their process of making the unknown familiar. This in turn shaped the way that they felt about settling, remaking home and realising their ambitions, desires and dreams. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claudia, for that wonderful paper and for sharing all of those fantastic images and quotes from the letters. It was really very powerfully evocative to hear the children's impressions of their new landscape and to get a sense of those through the visual as well. Just so people know, if you want to ask a question, you can either pop that in the chat box or you can raise your hand. So at the bottom of the screen, beside the kind of camera and microphone, there's a little person with their hand raised. So if you do that, I can call on you, you can pose your question. But maybe while people are gathering their thoughts together, Claudia, I can take chair's advantage and throw a couple at you. So one of the things that I was thinking about was just to get a bit more of a sense of the demographics of the kinds of children who are being involved here. There was some, I just noted that it was kind of quite male driven in many of the examples towards for the most of the paper, and then kind of halfway through we started to hear from a few girls. So thinking a little bit about gender and the kinds of forces that are maybe attracting some boys to go out and be settlers and conquer the land that might be at play there. And I was also thinking about age. Are these children who think of themselves as children? So they're obviously of the age of minority, but do they think of themselves as child migrants, or do they have a sort of slightly different sense of their role in the world?
Thanks, those are really great questions. So in terms of demographics, so absolutely, you're right to pick up on there is a gender imbalance, and I think partly that stems from the types of children that these institutions were potentially more willing to send. So what we find both in Bernardo's and the waifs and strays, certainly in the sort of sample that I've been working on, that there are generally more boys sent than there are girls. This is probably slightly different when we look in the context of some of the Australian migration. As I pointed out in one part of the paper, in the early or the first half of the 19th century, there was noted to be a particular gender imbalance. So females were particularly lacking in the New South Wales colony after a lot of the convict transportation sort of came to an end. So a lot of the schemes and a lot of the migration sort of programs focus there on trying to encourage more females to migrate over to the colony. But certainly in terms of migration from children's institutions for Barnardos and the waifs and strays, in my sample, it's heavily weighted towards males. That's not to say actually that there are more letters from boys or girls. Certainly with Barnardos' ups and downs, the very, very early issue of the magazines was targeted to a male audience, so young boy migrants. And I think probably a couple of years into its publication, after it had sort of created this sort of network of peers and migrants, sort of helping sustain sort of relationships between particularly the male migrants, it acknowledged the need for a dedicated female section. So what you get in reading the magazines is almost two separate magazines in one issue. So one talking directly to the boys about certain matters, and a lot of those were more about landscape, environment, obviously working the land, which many of the migrants were sort of expressly sent out to do, versus some of the more feminine, I guess, subject matter in the magazine. So things relating to kind of household management and family management for the girls. And actually in reading some of the letters, a lot of the there's a lot of difference really in the subject matter that migrants bring up themselves, particularly in the way that they engage with the landscape and environment. In terms of children thinking of themselves as children, that's a really difficult question. My gut reaction is no, they didn't want themselves as children. There has been a lot of work to because obviously by, I think it's about 1920 or 1930, there's over 100,000 children that are sent out to Canada. And there has been a lot of work to uncover the ages of these children, because they're not all recorded, and there's lots of controversy because children as young as 5 and 6 were sent out on these schemes, and particularly for those children, they weren't expected to work. They were sort of placed out in a sort of boarding out sort of arrangement, fostering and adoption arrangement with Canadian families. But then, of course, once they did reach a certain age, the expectation was that they were going to be contributing to those farms or those households through their labour. So for a lot of the letters that I've been looking at, I'd say the migrants that I'm looking at, particularly for the waifs and strays, because they sent children at a much older age than some of the other agencies. These children didn't think of themselves as children, and they wouldn't have done so, I think, in had they remained in Britain as well. This was the point, sort of at about the age of 13 or 14, that they would be going out to start various forms of employment, sometimes alongside or finishing up their education as well. So my sense from reading those letters is that they thought of themselves as young people, as young adults trying to make their own way in the world. But I haven't looked at, and I haven't actually come across many of the letters from much younger children. So I'm hoping over the course of my research I might be able to get some of those.
Absolutely fascinating. Thank you, Claudia. Don, you've got your hand up. Do you want to come in?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Claude. That was really fascinating. Who would have thought that it would be possible to find, anything? Never mind so much about children. I mean, I want to kind of just sort of waffle on forever about the levels of interest in this topic. Just to sort of clarify, I may have missed something, but it was a great paper and the images were fantastic. But did these institutions you're looking at, did they by any chance count the people, the kids inside them by ethnicity? So could you look at that as well as gender? And secondly, I'm always obsessing about the Irish, looking for them to be more important than perhaps they are everywhere in the world. It's just one of lifelong ambition. But anyway, but also, did these institutions select boys to go? Were they asked for boys to go? Because it's quite interesting, because in so many cases with these sorts of planned migrations, they actually desperately need women to top up the very male-focused colonial populations, for the purposes of family making. So you see, this kind of cuts against one grain, but on the other hand, I imagine that there were people just wanted to establish farms and wanted male farm workers and this kind of thing. But there's so many intricacies in that. I just wondered if you'd like to comment on that a little bit. I mean, obviously you can't talk in detail about everything I've mentioned there, but you know what I mean. Just give us a flavour of some of those things.
Yeah, so in terms of ethnicity, unfortunately not. I wish they did. So it's really difficult. So part of some of this research has come from research that I started 10 years ago, or over 10 years ago, for my PhD. And for that, I used a sample of, I think it's roughly about 1,500 children, some of whom migrated. I think about 400 of that sample migrated. Even on admission to these institutions, ethnicity isn't recorded, and then obviously it's not then recorded in any sort of different way in preparing them for emigration. So I do know of a few children that were, I suppose, minorities. But it's hard to say where they're from. So a lot of the institutional material will just make a note saying that this child is of colour, and that's it. So it's really difficult to know sort of their journeys prior to institutionalisation, but also their sort of background and culture, ethnically speaking as well. So it's really difficult to know that. Male versus female. So yes, absolutely. So in a lot of places, females were needed more to sort of redress sort of gender imbalances. I think what I found in the study of these institutions is that they were more likely to send boys. I think it sort of fits in with those sort of narratives about empire building, and certainly in terms of kind of the labour opportunities that they were being prepared for, really were focused on kind of agricultural work, working the land, clearing the land, and particularly in the later 19th century, where I guess a lot of that territory in Canada was kind of expanding into the northwest. So certainly initially, in the late 19th century, a lot of it was focused on sending boys over rather than girls. I don't have statistics in hand, but I can dig them out from the research that I've done if that's of interest to any of the research that you're doing. So that, yeah, it would be something to worth calculating, really. It's difficult as well to know exactly who emigrated, and part of that is an issue with the sources. It's much easier, I think, to get a sense of who migrated from the Waifs and Strays Society, just because of the way that the case records are catalogued and preserved. So you can select children's cases by their outcome, whereas with Bernardo's, it takes a lot of record linkage to find out what has happened to a particular child. So all of their sort of records are kept separately. So all the admissions are kept in one part of the archive, and then sort of discharges are in another. So it's really difficult to select one child and then, you know, sort of know instantly sort of what happened. But that's, yeah, I think something that probably needs a lot more work, I think, collectively across the field in terms of child migration. But I think probably some of the conclusions that I've drawn sort of build on some of the work by people like Ellen Boucher and Lydia Murdoch, who have really taken that focus on sort of emigration and children's role in sort of building the nation. And I think boys play a really crucial role in that sort of work.
Fascinating. Thank you very much. So much we could talk about, but yeah. And did you say, is this some of this material going into the book, or are you now developing beyond the book?
Yeah, so some of this, so a lot of the stuff from the Waifs and Strays will be in the OUP book that's coming out hopefully rather than and this is something that I'm taking in new directions, much more globally. So I'm bringing in other institutions, so Bernardo's, a lot of Bernardo's work will be in hopefully a second book, and some of some articles that I'm preparing at the moment. And then the Australian sort of immigration is something that haven't even thought about at the moment. So it's very much a work in progress.
Lots of interesting stuff on the Irish migrations, planned migrations. You'll know all about those, but yeah, and it'll probably offer some very interesting comparative material. Yeah,
definitely.
And there's quite a few, some almost gruesomely a famous case like the Grey Scheme, you know, and the emptying of Belfast workhouses of poor lasses who are seen as degenerate when they arrive. And you actually know those stories, but they're really being farmed off to Australia to be married to old men. You know, pretty grim thought. But a lot of the sort of gendered narrative around them is very much that they're, you know, I mean, even if they're 14, they're like somehow reformed or not reformed women of the night kind of thing, whereas what they actually are is just extremely poor girls from workhouses who have got some skills, you know. So the Grey Scheme is one where everyone's looked after, but there are other schemes where they're not so looked after. You know, it's fascinating stuff, but it may or may not, you know, dovetail with exactly what you do, because I'm not sure how much personal narrative there is from those girls, but certainly the story is well told, but the personal narrative is not there. It's a third-party narrative in most cases, as you find anyway, don't you, generally speaking? But really fascinating, stimulating paper.
Thank you. And I think just in terms of the Australian sort of stories that I'm sort of uncovering, it's very much, I'm looking through it through the lens of emigration. What I'm doing is looking at who's in residential institutions in the later 19th century. So I've just been doing some research on Newcastle Industrial School, so that's sort of 2 hours north of Sydney, and I've been doing a lot of family history and genealogical tracing of girls admitted to institutions there, and actually working backwards to see where their mothers sort of grandparents come over as, you know, either through assisted schemes like Rebecca, who came through on the Earl Grey scheme, or via transportation. So yeah, it's all sort of interconnected, I guess. So
from industrial school to industrial school, the story of migratory failure.
Yeah, and it's, you know, it's you know, for some of them 3-4 generations of being institutionalized, which is, you know, quite shocking, really.
Yeah, and yet industrial schools try to put a nice suit on boys and send them out to apprenticeships or send them to the colonies. Same thing, really, in terms of improvement. Fascinating story. I must stop taking up so much time. I do have to jump off. I've got somewhere else to go, I'm afraid. So if I do go early, Panikos will wrap things up, or Anna will. But thank you so much. I really enjoyed that, as you can tell.
Thanks so much, Don. That's brilliant. We'll do a final call for any questions for Claudia, because we have kept you on your toes now for a good hour and 15 minutes. So I've had some lovely comments in the chat for people saying how much they've enjoyed listening to the presentation. So I'll give it a minute. Perhaps I'll squeeze in a small one, Claudia, which is just on the case of Francesca, which I thought was, oh, sorry, Rebecca from New South Wales. I thought that case was so interesting, and the kind of triangulation of sources that you're doing there seems like a really kind of a technique that's obviously proving to generate a lot of material, but one that must be very time consuming. So I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about this kind of like untangling some of these knots in these cases.
Yeah, I mean, it's been really difficult actually, especially with the Australian stuff, because I think part of it has been obviously with the pandemic. So I've been working a lot with the State Library in New South Wales and then the New South Wales State Archives, two separate sort of arenas. And there's so many institutions set up in the 19th century in New South Wales. And they've got some amazing databases and indices, which have pretty much enabled me to get about 100,000 or just over 100,000 names of children that pass through institutions in maybe the course of about 100 years. So it's been really difficult to try and narrow that down actually, because some of them, you know, with very similar names and very imperfect ways of recording information in things like censuses, some of them you can't find any sort of information about. So I guess it's been up to selecting sort of much narrower samples and seeing what that gives me, and then simply spending days and days on things like Find My Past and Ancestry to try and build up that kind of family history. And I mean, I didn't really do much of this in my previous research, so it's been a skill that I have come to fairly new, and it's always a work in progress. So, you know, I've sort of started to connect with a lot of, you know, like professional family historians and genealogists who've offered some great tips and advice, but I think, yeah, it's hugely time consuming. I think the really interesting thing about it is that I think particularly in Australia, with this kind of, you know, convict history and the kind of history of like a very new sort of colony, is that a lot of people are really interested in tracing back their ancestors to their sort of British or Irish roots, because that's where a lot of them are from. So actually a lot of the work, you know, sort of that initial legwork has been done by ancestors. So you can triangulate and verify a lot of your own research with research that, you know, people have been doing over the course of decades to try and trace their own family trees. But obviously that sort of work, I think that one of the issues that I'm grappling with at the moment is some of the ethical considerations about that kind of work and when to bring in descendants of some of the people that I'm writing about. And, you know, especially on things like Ancestry and Find My Past, you know, quite often, you know, a family member will have a lot of information about someone that I'm studying, but won't necessarily know that they've been institutionalized at some point or been in a workhouse or, you know, that kind of stuff. So yeah, there's a lot of ethical things to think about and considerations that I think are just going to be sort of kind of a bit of a work in process, and thinking about ways potentially that actually can be used as a positive and sort of incorporate you know, kind of like descendants and stuff into more sort of public history projects and stuff later on down the line. So yeah.
Fantastic. All right. Well, thank you so much, Claudia. We'll draw proceedings to a close now, and thank you, Megan, for putting the information in the chat. So our next seminar will be on the 23rd of February at 5 o'clock with Siobhan Lambert-Hurley, who's going to be talking about food identity and difference in travel writing from Muslim South Asia. So hopefully we'll get to see some other fantastic pictures then, and sort of hear some similar tales of travel writing, although I'm sure I'm going to need a snack if it's going to be a whole seminar about food at 5 o'clock on a Wednesday evening. So it leaves me with no further ado than to thank our speaker once again. Thank you so much, Claudia, for that really rich and fascinating paper, and thank you all for coming and for your attention. So yeah, cheers everybody, take care, and goodbye.
Thanks.
Bye bye, thank you.